When we think of the Age of Discovery, we often imagine intrepid explorers wrestling their ships through stormy seas, sailing into the unknown in the hopes of finding spices, gold, or maybe even a direct route to Asia. But what if I told you there was another way to get to Asia, not by sea, but by land? Because in the 16th century, that's exactly what some Europeans thought they'd do. They would sail across the Atlantic, then simply head west until they hit the Pacific and sail themselves to the riches of Cathay. Of course, that's easier said than done, and what they found instead was not China, but North America. The question is, why did they keep going? What could possibly make them want to brave all those hardships and cross an entire continent? Hi, everyone. Welcome to this channel. Today we begin our journey in Chapter 1, A Dream of Golden Cities. The year is 1539, and for the past 2 decades, the Spanish have been hearing tales from their silver mines of a nearby kingdom made of gold. They call it El Dorado, and it's rumored to be located somewhere far to the north. Now, we're gonna be honest here. This isn't the first story about El Dorado. That honor goes to the Muisca people who first heard these legends from their ancestors long before the Spanish ever arrived. But for now, let's follow the conquistadors who are determined to find this golden kingdom. But they're not alone. In 1528, the French heard of a similar place called, and years later, the English would speak of the 7 golden cities of Cíbola too. Our story is one of ambition, a desire for wealth, and a chance to claim a part of the new world for your country before anyone else does. It's a story worth telling. So without any further ado, let's go back to 1540. The men are preparing for what will likely be a months-long journey. Supplies are being gathered and accounted for, and a priest has been asked to join the expedition to convert any natives they encounter along the way. Francisco de Coronado is the man in charge. He's a relatively low, hunking conquistador, but he's determined to succeed where others have failed. He leads a group of about 300 men north from Mexico City, following rumors of gold and other riches to be found in faraway lands. They trek through unfamiliar territory, encountering new plants, animals and people unlike anything they've seen before. When winter approaches, Coronado and his men reach a village inhabited by people unlike any they've seen in all of Mexico. These Native Americans don't look or behave like the indigenous peoples they've encountered in the south, and they seem to know nothing of the Spanish crown. The conquistadors are fascinated by these people and their ways, and take great interest in learning about their culture. As they continue their journey, they learn more about the tribes they've encountered and the land they inhabit. They learn that the tribes are peaceful and live off the buffalo that roamed the plains, and that the area is full of natural wonders like rivers, lakes, and forests. Despite the difficulties they face, including harsh weather conditions, dwindling supplies and conflicts with local tribes, the conquistadors press on in search of the golden cities they believe lie ahead. The story of Coronado's quest is one filled with danger, intrigue, and adventure. Will he find the riches he seeks? And what will be the fate of the Native Americans he encounters along the way? Stay tuned to find out. Francisco de Coronado was a conquistador. To put it simply, a conquistador was a Spanish soldier who took part in the conquest of America. It was a dangerous job, but the rewards were great. If you were lucky enough to survive the journey, that is. Coronado had already proven himself in battle and was eager for more glory. But he wasn't the only one. There were plenty of other adventurers looking to make their mark on the New World. One of these was Alvar Nuez y Cabeza de Vaca, who became famous for surviving a shipwreck and spending 8 years living with Native Americans, before returning to Spain in 1541. Then there was Hernando de Soto, who led an expedition that explored much of the southeastern United States during 1539 and 1543, being the first European to do so. His journey is notable because of the extensive geographical knowledge it provided, as well as its impact on the indigenous populations he encountered. But let's focus on Coronado, shall we? What drove him and his men to embark on such a perilous journey? Well, for starters, there was the promise of wealth. Coronado was searching for gold, silver, and other precious metals that were rumored to be abundant in the region. But he wasn't just motivated by greed. He was also driven by a desire for glory and adventure. Coronado wanted to explore unknown lands and make discoveries that would bring him fame and fortune back in Spain. Of course, it didn't hurt that he was also eager to expand the reach of the Spanish Empire. By finding gold in these new territories, he could help establish Spain as a major player in the global economy and bring more power and prestige to his homeland. But despite his noble goals, Coronado's journey was not without its challenges. The expedition faced many hardships, including battles with Native Americans, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Yet Coronado and his men pressed on, determined to succeed where others had failed. They traveled over 2,000 miles across the American Southwest, exploring areas that had never before been seen by Europeans. Along the way, they encountered various Native American tribes, some of whom were friendly and helped them on their journey, while others were hostile and fought against the conquistadors. Despite the dangers and difficulties they faced, Coronado and his men made some remarkable discoveries. They found vast quantities of gold and other precious metals, as well as a variety of plant and animal species that were unknown in Europe. They also learned about the customs, traditions, and way of life of the Native American tribes they encountered. In the end, however, Coronado's search for El Dorado proved to be fruitless. He never found the legendary City of Gold, but his journey had other rewards. He returned to Spain with tales of the riches and wonders of the American Southwest, which inspired other explorers to venture into these uncharted territories. Coronado's expedition marked a significant chapter in the history of exploration and discovery, and his legacy continues to be celebrated today. Now, it may come as no surprise that Coronado's journey wasn't just about finding gold. Sure, that would have been pretty neat, but there was more to the story. For starters, the Spanish were always looking to spread Christianity wherever they went, and this trip was no different. In fact, Coronado brought along a priest specifically for that purpose. But it wasn't all about religion either. The Spanish were also interested in learning more about the lands and people of the New World, and they weren't shy about taking what they wanted. After all, they were conquerors. However, they did learn quite a bit about the native cultures, languages, and customs, which would have been useful back home. And of course, there was the gold. Although they didn't find the fabled city of El Dorado, they did discover valuable mineral resources that would later become important to the Spanish Empire. Ultimately, Coronado's journey was a complex mix of motives. Religion, exploration, and conquest all played a part, but it was the search for gold that really drove the story. So what can we expect as this series continues? Well, stay tuned to find out what happens next on Coronado's journey. We'll explore the landscapes and cultures he encountered, the challenges he faced, and the ultimate outcome of his quest. You'll see how his journey marked the beginning of Spain's footprint in the American Southwest, and the lasting impact it had on the region's history. Don't miss out on any of the action. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. Join us next time as we continue our journey with Coronado and his men. You won't want to miss it. See you soon. Hello my friend, welcome to episode 2 of our series chronicling the adventures of the conquistadors. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome aboard. We hope you enjoy our tales of adventure, history, and daring do from the men who changed the world. For our regular viewers, welcome back. We're so glad you keep coming back to see what the boys are up to. In Chapter 1, we left off with Hernando Cortés and his ragtag army of about 600 Spaniards and 4,000 allies, having just completed the conquest of the mighty Aztec Empire. In this episode, we will see how Cortés' conquest of Mexico would serve as the springboard for another great venture into the American Southwest. So get yourself a cup of coffee or hot chocolate, sit down and settle in because it's story time. By 1521, the year of the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spain had become the first European power to gain a foothold in the New World, and that Portugal was not far behind with their colony of Brazil. Spain was quick to capitalize on its early start. The Spanish crown realized that the riches of Mexico were almost beyond comprehension. Gold, silver, precious stones, and above all else, the labor of the indigenous natives made the colony almost immediately profitable. Within 2 decades, the colony of New Spain would be sending back to Spain some 15 million ounces of gold and 275 million ounces of silver. This unprecedented influx of wealth allowed Spain to establish many more expeditions into the unknown interior of the New World in search of more riches. But the riches of Mexico were only one part of the equation. There was also the matter of souls to convert. See, the Spanish were very concerned with the spread of Christianity, and once they learned that the Aztecs had over 30 million subjects, well, that was a lot of potential converts. The Spanish crown wanted to make sure that the indigenous people of Mexico were properly cared for, and to that end, a massive effort was undertaken to build churches and schools across the colony. The Spanish friars and missionaries were tasked with teaching the natives about the one true God and converting them away from their old gods. The clergy were also instrumental in helping to establish the colony as a whole. assisting in the creation of new settlements and helping to govern the colony during its early years. This close relationship between the church and the state would continue throughout the colonial period and have a lasting impact on the culture and society of Mexico. With the wealth and the manpower secured, Spain began to cast its gaze northward toward the vast unexplored territories of the American Southwest. You see, since Cortez's arrival in the New World, there had been a steady stream of rumors carried northward by traders, priests, and native guides, tales of 7 cities of gold, of immense riches, and of entire provinces where the streets were paved with precious metals. These stories were no doubt exaggerated, but there was probably some truth to them as well, and that was enough to pique the interest of the Spanish crown. Another reason for the crown's interest in the northern territories was the desire to control trade with the Pacific. The Spanish had established a trading post in the port of Navidad on the Pacific coast of Mexico, but they wanted to have more direct access to the riches of the East. By controlling the Pacific coast, the Spanish could more easily trade with China, India, and other parts of Asia, which were known to be rich in spices, silk, and other luxury goods. They hoped to find a route through or around the Rocky Mountains that would allow them to reach the Pacific Ocean and establish a direct trade route. This would give them control over the lucrative trade in Chinese silk and porcelain, as well as access to the markets of India and the East Indies. There was yet another reason why the Spanish crown became so interested in exploring the north. See, the desire for wealth and power was not limited to Spain alone. France, England, and Portugal were also eager to explore and conquer new lands and establish their own colonies in the New World. This meant that Spain had to act quickly to secure its hold on the riches of the Americas. If they didn't, then some other European power might get there first and claim the land for themselves. By 1539, the Spanish had decided that it was time to take action. They sent out a conquistador named Francisco Coronado to explore the northern territories and see what riches they might contain. Coronado and his men traveled for months through the deserts and mountains of the Southwest, searching for the legendary cities of gold. They encountered many Native American tribes along the way, some of which were friendly and helpful, while others were hostile and fought against the Spanish. Despite these challenges, Coronado and his men pressed on, eventually reaching the Grand Canyon. They were disappointed not to find the riches they were seeking, but they did discover a vast and beautiful land that was rich in other resources. It may seem odd that the Spanish would send an expedition into the middle of what we today call the desert Southwest, an area that is hot and dry and not particularly hospitable to large groups of people. But it's important to remember that when Coronado arrived in the 1500s, the American Southwest was a very different place than it is today. In fact, it was much greener and much wetter. There was much more vegetation and a lot more bodies of water. The climate had not yet become as arid as it is now. Also, the timing of Coronado's expedition was not ideal. He arrived during a period of drought, which made the already challenging terrain even more difficult to navigate. This is likely a major reason why the expedition was not successful in finding the fabled cities of gold, as the lack of water and vegetation would have made it very difficult to support large settlements. Additionally, the tribes that lived in the area at the time were largely nomadic, and did not have the resources to sustain a large population. As such, the Spanish were not able to find the kind of wealth and abundance that they were looking for. But this does not mean that the region was without value. It simply means that the Spanish were not able to recognize it at the time. Coronado's expedition was launched from the Spanish colony of New Spain, which was centered in what is today Mexico. At the time, New Spain was one of several colonies that Spain had established in the Americas, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola. However, New Spain was by far the most valuable of these colonies due to its vast mineral wealth and the riches that could be extracted from the land. Because of this, New Spain became the hub of Spanish activity in the Americas and the launching pad for many expeditions into the interior of the continent. In addition to being a center of wealth, New Spain was also home to a large number of indigenous peoples who provided the labor necessary to extract and transport the colony's many resources. Furthermore, New Spain was well connected to Spain itself through a series of shipping routes that made it easy to transport goods and people between the two locations. This proximity and connectivity made New Spain the ideal location from which to launch an expedition such as Coronado's. The colony had the resources, labor, and transportation infrastructure necessary to support a large and expensive undertaking. We hope you enjoyed today's chapter. If you did, don't forget to click like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time. Hello, my friends. This is chapter 3 of my series, The Coronado Expedition. In this chapter, we'll be talking about where the whisper of began, so grab yourself a mug of coffee or perhaps some horchata and let us begin our tale. Now, when it comes to pinpointing exactly who first spread the rumors of the 7 cities of gold, the truth is, no one person can shoulder that blame, nor do we know if a single person was responsible or if several people contributed to the legend. Nonetheless, the story goes back to 1528 to a pair of survivors from a shipwrecked expedition. Their names were Alvaro y Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban the Moor. Their harrowing tale of survival against all odds is one of daring-do, hardship and tragedy. And when their story reached the ears of the right people, it set in motion events that would lead to the Coronado expedition. Let us tell you their tale. Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban the Moor were part of a large fleet that left Spain in 1527 under the command of the conquistador de A. The goal of the expedition was to find gold, God, and glory in what today we call Florida. They landed near Tampa Bay in what is today called Florida, but almost immediately after making landfall, their 4 ships were caught in a terrible storm. 3 of the ships were lost, including the one carrying most of their supplies. Only 1 ship remained, and it was damaged beyond repair, so they did the only thing they could. They unloaded the ship onto the beach, lit it on fire, and watched as their dreams of glory went up in smoke. And so began the survivors' 8-year ordeal. They struggled across the hostile landscape with only a few meager possessions, enduring starvation, thirst, exposure, and attacks by Native Americans. Of the 62 men who had survived the shipwreck, only 3 emerged from the wilderness alive: Cabeza de Vaca, Esteban the Moor, and another man named Durantes. And as luck would have it, they stumbled upon a friendly tribe and were taken in as guests. This tribe is thought to be the Apalachee, and they stayed with the Apalachee for several months while recovering from their ordeal. When they were healthy enough to travel again, they continued on their journey until they reached the coast and eventually made their way back to Mexico City. When the survivors arrived in Mexico City, their story was met with disbelief. No one believed that only 3 men had survived such a terrible ordeal. Even the viceroy was skeptical until he saw the 3 men's horses, which were covered with lice, long hair, unkempt beards, clothes in tatters, and bodies emaciated from hunger. It was then that the full horror of their ordeal finally hit home for everyone. The survivors gave a detailed account of their travels inland, including their experiences with the Native Americans and descriptions of the land they had crossed. According to their reports, the interior of the continent was uninhabited except for some nomadic tribes of Indians who traveled from place to place in search of food. The explorers said they had seen no cities, but they did say they had heard rumors from the natives about rich cities far to the north, and those cities were filled with gold. In spite of the skepticism surrounding their story, the survivors were rewarded for their efforts. Cabeza de Vaca was given noble status and granted encomiendas in Cuba and Spain. He was also charged with planning a new expedition into the interior of North America to find the rumored cities of gold. However, the second expedition was never approved by the Spanish crown. But before we move on, I want to point out that although these reports didn't result in any immediate expeditions into the Northern Territory, they did contribute to the general body of knowledge regarding the geography and peoples of the New World, and they also helped to inspire later explorers, who were searching for gold and glory. The report of the survivors reaching the Spanish authorities in Mexico City in late 1536, early 1537. Soon the rumor of reached the ears of a young conquistador named Francisco de Coronado. And I'm sure you already know this, because if you're watching this series, you probably read the book or watched the movie. Coronado was the governor of the city of Nueva Galicia, which is today western Mexico. But even before he received word of the fabled city of gold, he was considering an expedition into the Northern Territories. Coronado had come to Mexico in 1535 as part of the army sent to subdue the Aztec Empire. After witnessing firsthand the wealth of the Aztec ruler Moctezuma, he became convinced that there were other Native American societies just as rich, if not richer, farther to the north. So now we come to the spark that ignited his ambition. On April 23, 1539, Coronado wrote a letter to the Spanish crown asking permission to lead an expedition into the Northern Territory to find the 7 cities of gold. Now, as with many things in life, there are varying accounts of what actually took place. Some historians say Coronado was directly inspired by the reports of Cabeza de Vaca and the others, and this is what set him on his path to explore the American Southwest. However, other historians argue that the reports of gold were simply a small part of Coronado's plans. and that he was motivated primarily by a desire to explore and conquer new lands in the name of the Spanish crown. Regardless of whether or not Coronado based his decision solely on the survivors' reports, he was certainly aware of them and likely took them into consideration when planning his expedition. What we know for certain is that Coronado's quest for El Dorado led him on a journey through parts of what are today Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Kansas. Along the way, he encountered many different Native American tribes, some of whom were living in cities that were much more advanced than anything he had seen in Mexico. Although he never found the legendary City of Gold, Coronado's expedition did discover vast quantities of gold, silver, and other precious metals in the Northern Territories. But it's important to remember that the story doesn't end here. As we look back on the tale of Coronado and the 7 cities of gold, it's easy to get caught up in the adventure and excitement of the story. We think of daring explorers, mysterious cities, and untold riches. But it's important to remember that this is just a story that has been told and retold for centuries, until it has become a blend of fact and fiction. We know that Coronado and his men were real people who really explored parts of North America in the 16th century, and we know that they were looking for gold and other riches. But the idea of a mysterious city made of gold is likely a product of the imagination. There is no evidence that any such city existed, and yet the legend persists. It's as possible that the stories of gold were based on actual encounters with Native Americans who wore gold jewelry or had gold items in their temples or other buildings. But ultimately, we can't be sure. And this isn't the only example of how the legend of Coronado and the 7 cities of gold has been shaped by the imagination. Many of the details of the story, including the names of the cities and even the number of cities, come from a 19th century novel by Washington Irving called The Conquest of Mexico. Irving's novel is a work of fiction, but he used real historical events and people as inspiration for his story. So it's easy to see how the legend has become so muddled over time. Despite the fact that the story is largely a myth, it's still an important one. It tells us about the Spanish conquest of North America and the impact it had on the Native Americans. It also gives us a glimpse into the minds of the conquistadors and their quest for gold and glory. But it's important to remember that the legend is just that, a legend. The 7 cities of gold may have captured our imaginations, but they may not have ever really existed. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to like the video if you did. Thanks for watching. Alright, so Chapter 4, The Man Chosen. When we left off at the end of Chapter 3, Antonio de Mendoza had just become the first Viceroy of New Spain, and one of his first major tasks was to figure out what to do about this crazy conquistador named Francisco Pizarro, who'd apparently gone and conquered an entire empire in Peru without asking permission and certainly against the orders of the crown. So Mendoza had 2 major goals. 1. Figure out what to do about Pizarro, we'll get to that in a later chapter. And 2. Find a way to conquer the rest of the continent and bring it under the control of the Spanish crown. Because even though Pizarro had shown that the indigenous people of the Americas were quite up to the task of stopping determined European invaders, there was still a lot of land left to explore and plunder, and Mendoza needed someone to do it. He needed someone special. So let's meet our man. Born in 1510 in the Spanish city of Cíbola, Francisco de Coronado was a young man when he arrived in Mexico in 1535. Despite his youth, he was already married, which was a sign of both maturity and the fact that his father was influential enough to snag him a powerful wife. In fact, his father-in-law was the treasurer of Spain's powerful Holy Brotherhood, a position that came with considerable wealth and influence. With money to burn, Coronado quickly set about making a name for himself in the New World. In 1539, he was appointed the governor of Nueva Galicia, a captaincy that encompassed the modern-day Mexican states of Nayarit, Jalisco, Colima, and part of the northwest of Mexico. It wasn't a particularly difficult appointment, more of a sinecure really, the kind of position you get when your father-in-law is the treasurer of the Holy Brotherhood, and you're willing to go live in a faraway land where basically no one is going to say no to you. But it was perfect for Coronado because while the position didn't come with much work, it did come with some opportunity. See, Nueva Galicia was right next door to what we today call Arizona and New Mexico, and there were all sorts of rumors circulating around the riches to be found there, including from one Francisco de who'd landed in Florida in 1513 and then made his way north. He told tales of great cities made of gold and said that, just in the province of Culiacan alone, which is right next door to the modern-day Mexican state of Sonora, he'd seen 200,000 golden idols in temples and palaces. In fact, he claimed that just one of these golden idols weighed as much as a donkey, and everyone believed him. Well, maybe not everyone, but enough people believed him that a lot of people wanted to find this golden province for themselves. And Coronado wanted that glory and treasure more than anything else. But why choose him? Why did Mendoza choose this young, untested governor over more experienced men? Well, for one thing, he was hot on the trail of Quivira already. In 1540, Coronado sent out an expedition to find the legendary gold cities, and it didn't return. So clearly he was already committed to finding this place. But more important than that was the fact that Coronado was young and ambitious, and Mendoza thought that he could use the man. And in fairness to Mendoza, he probably did use him. He got everything he wanted out of Coronado. In fact, let's talk about Coronado's personality for a minute, because if we spend the next several chapters talking about how he supposedly led his men on a quest that resulted in the near-total devastation of the American Southwest, we need to humanize the guy a little bit, because let's be honest, he was kind of a dick. Don't get me wrong, he had some good qualities, but he was also stubborn, rash, easily influenced by flattery, and not nearly as experienced as he thought he was. After all, he'd never led an expedition like this before. This was his first time, but he wanted that glory, and what's more, he thought he deserved it. He believed that he was destined for greatness, and that all of his contemporaries knew it too. Here's how an early modern historian describes him. Of all the Spanish soldiers who came to the New World, few were so self-opinionated, so vain and so completely lacking in common sense as Coronado. He loved to hear himself praised and would listen for hours to those who flattered him. He was reckless, obstinate, boastful, and ambitious. He was given to fits of anger which he soon forgot. He was violent, avaricious, and cruel to a most extreme degree. But he was also very handsome and of high lineage. A man who loved to hear himself praised and would listen for hours to those who flattered him. You classic sociopath. But look, despite his flaws, he was still an adventurer and a conqueror. And if we're judging by those standards, he was a pretty damn good one. He wasn't afraid to take risks, and he was usually able to pull them off. And he was relentless in his pursuit of wealth and power. If he set his mind to something, he didn't rest until he got it. And what's more, he was utterly convinced that he was doing the will of God. Like many conquerors before and after him, Coronado justified his actions in religious terms, claiming that he was bringing Christianity to the heathens of the north. In reality, he was just looking for gold. But in his own mind, he was a holy man on a divine mission, and he took that belief with him on his journey into the heart of America. Alright, well, now that we know a little bit about our man, let's follow him as he sets out on the adventure of his life. Coronado set out from Compostela on March 22, 1540 with about 300 men and 2,500 cattle, horses, and sheep. They headed north through the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains and then along the western edge of the Great Plains. As they traveled, they encountered several Native American tribes, some of whom had never even heard of the Spanish before. The conquistadors wasted no time in making an impression. They burned their villages and killed or enslaved their people. And when they weren't busy destroying everything in sight, they were searching for gold. But the only gold they found was in the legends and myths that the natives told them about a magical city called Quivira. After months of fruitless searching, Coronado decided to head back south. But on the way, he made one last stop at a settlement called Tigix, which the natives told him was close to Quivira. But when he arrived, he found nothing but deserted streets and empty houses. The town was completely abandoned. Coronado was devastated. He'd come all this way and found nothing but dirt and dust. Just then, a group of natives approached cautiously. They told Coronado that they were from a nearby settlement, and they'd come to warn him that their great lord, the king of an empire called the Zuni, was planning to attack him. Coronado should turn back while he still could. Coronado was furious. How dare these savages threaten him? He was a conquistador, the governor of a province, the darling of the viceroy. How could they possibly think that he would turn tail and flee? And so he did the only reasonable thing he could think of and attacked. His men rode into Tigix and slaughtered everyone in sight. Then he took what he wanted and burned the rest. When he was done, he mounted his horse and rode out of town, following the natives' directions to the kingdom of the Sunnis. All the while, his men grew weaker and weaker from hunger and disease. Many of them died, and those who lived became skinnier and more desperate by the day. Still, Coronado pressed on, convinced that Quivira was just around the corner and that all their suffering would soon be over. But he was wrong. When they finally reached the Zuni capital, Coronado and his men were greeted not by the riches and splendor he'd imagined, but by a small village of mud huts. The king of the Zuni, hearing that the Spaniards were looking for gold, offered to help them find it. He told them that just over the next hill was a province called Huico, where the streets were paved with gold and the houses were made of precious stones. Coronado's eyes gleamed at the prospect of untold riches. But the Zuni king warned him that the people of Huico were fierce warriors, and that he should bring a large force to conquer them. Coronado, eager to get his hands on some gold, agreed. But when he arrived at Huico, he found nothing but deserted fields and empty villages. There was no sign of the great wealth he'd been promised, and the Zuni king's offer turned out to be a lie. Defeated and demoralized, Coronado and his men began the long trek home. Along the way, more of them died, and those who lived grew weaker and weaker, until they were too exhausted to continue. Eventually they stumbled into a settlement and begged the locals for food and water. The people took pity on them and helped them recover. And when they were strong enough, Coronado continued his journey, this time with only about 60 men. He traveled through what is today Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, encountering various Native American tribes along the way. Some of them were friendly, but others were hostile. The conquistadors fought many battles, and each time they won, they took prisoners and stole their supplies. But as the weeks went by, their numbers dwindled, and eventually they were too weak to fight anymore. Finally, in July of 1541, Coronado and his men arrived in Compostela, where he'd started his journey almost 2 years before. They were only 60 men now, and they looked like skeletons. But Coronado was still determined to find Quivira, even if it meant walking. He left his horse with the others and set out on foot, accompanied by only a handful of men. For 3 days they walked through the desert, subsisting on what little food they could find. Then suddenly, just when they were about to die of starvation, they stumbled upon a small settlement. There they learned that they were only a few miles from Quivira, and their spirits lifted. Maybe they hadn't lost everything. Maybe all their suffering would soon be over. But when they arrived in Quivira, it was just another small village of mud huts, just like the ones they'd seen before. There was no gold, no great wealth, no legendary city. Coronado was heartbroken. He'd dreamed of riches and glory, and instead he had nothing but dirt and dust. But even in defeat, he was a conquistador. He refused to give up. He decided to keep searching for Quivira, even if it meant spending the rest of his life in the desert. But he never got the chance. As he was leaving Quivira, he was captured by the natives and taken to a nearby settlement where he was tortured and killed. The date is uncertain, but it was probably sometime in 1542. So ends the tale of Francisco de Coronado, conqueror of the American Southwest. Not exactly a household name these days, but back in the 16th century, he was a legend. Alright, thanks for watching. Chapter 5, Gathering the Expedition. Well, here we are at Chapter 5 already. It's been a while, but I am very happy to be back on the channel today. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your patience with me, as I have been dealing with some real-life matters. They're nothing too serious, but they have taken up most of my time and energy in these past few months. I have missed making videos, though, and I love you all dearly for your comments telling me to get back into it, or your notes telling me that you missed my voice, or your messages asking if I was okay. So again, thank you all so much. And without further ado, let's jump right into this chapter. We last left off with our conquistador arriving into the capital city of Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City, only he doesn't know that yet. He has heard rumors of gold and, even more importantly, the location of the legendary city of Quito, or what we would call El Dorado. He wants to set out and find this city before anyone else does. To do this, he knows he will need supplies, men, and most importantly, horses. As soon as he arrived into the city, he got to work rounding up men to join his expedition. Some were eager to go and make their fortunes. Others, well, they were paid handsomely to join. Let's just say there were some threats involved. We can picture him striding through the plaza with a list of names of those who had been summoned to join his expedition. Men were told to come bearing gifts, a token of good faith that they could be trusted and would not run away or betray him when the time came. There is no accounting for the sheer number of people that eventually joined this expedition, but it is recorded that there were at least several hundred soldiers. This may not seem like a large number to us, but remember, this is 1524 and guns were still relatively new on the scene. You needed lots of men to effectively fight a battle. There were also thousands of natives who joined them, too, both willingly and unwillingly. These were mostly servants, porters, and guides. There were also some priests who joined, too. All in all, the whole group would number in the thousands. The first leg of the journey would take them north, following the coast up towards what we today call San Francisco. The second leg would take them inland, where it is here they hoped to find gold and glory. But enough about the people, don't forget the animals. Who could forget the animals? In total, there were over 300 elephants, 300 horses, and 800 head of cattle. That is one heck of a herd. If you think moving thousands of people through the jungle would be hard, try adding 300 elephants to that equation. Honestly, I think it would have been easier to move the herd of elephants than it was to feed them. Just imagine the amount of food that these gigantic beasts would consume every day, let alone the amount of water they must have needed. Even taking care of the horses and cattle would have been an undertaking by itself. Friar Marcos de Niza played a crucial role in getting this expedition funded and started. He had traveled to Mexico from Spain to serve as a missionary. While there, he became acquainted with some important people, including the governor of the region, Antonio de Mendoza. Friar Marcos was the first European to explore Arizona and Southern California. His writings about the lands he explored helped to inspire Cortés and his conquest of the Aztecs. It was during his travels that he claimed to have seen 7 golden cities, which could only mean one thing: the legendary lost city of gold. Quito or El Dorado. He was able to convince the governor of the region that these cities were full of gold and riches, beyond imagination, and that all they needed to do was find them. With the governor's help, Hernando Cortés set out with his men, animals, and all of the supplies they could carry to find these golden cities. It is said that when Cortés and his men finally set out on their journey, it was quite a sight to behold. The men were dressed in their finest armor, their swords and spears gleaming in the sun. Their banners were unfurled, catching the wind as they marched forward, confident and excited for what lay ahead. Can you picture it? A massive group of men striding forward, their faces determined, their eyes scanning the horizon for the first glimpse of gold. The cattle and sheep were driven before them, their bells tinkling in the air, the horses pawing the ground, ready to carry them further into the unknown. It must have been a sight that would have made the very earth tremble beneath their feet. But with all this excitement, with all this anticipation for what lay ahead, there was still a part of Cortés that was filled with doubt. He knew the dangers that lay ahead, the hardships and challenges that his men would face. Would they be able to endure the journey? Would they be able to find the fabled city of gold? Only time would tell. For now, they pressed on, their spirits high, their determination unwavering. Now, I don't know about you guys, but all of this talk about gold and riches and legendary cities has got me feeling pretty excited. I mean, who wouldn't want to go on an adventure to find lost treasure? Of course, I'm not suggesting that we go and conquer any indigenous tribes along the way, because that's not okay. But exploring the unknown, that's always been a part of human nature. Just think about all the explorers who sailed across the oceans to discover new lands, or the adventurers who trekked through uncharted territories. They were driven by the same curiosity and thirst for discovery that lies within all of us. Maybe it's what drives us to watch videos about ancient civilizations and lost treasures. Maybe it's what makes us dream of far-off adventures and exotic locales. Whatever it is, it's a part of what makes us human. Of course, it's important to remember that exploration and discovery should be done ethically and responsibly. We should learn from the mistakes of the past and ensure that we are respectful of other cultures and the environment. That's why it's so important to study history, to understand the impact that our actions have on the world around us. So as we continue to explore the world around us, whether physically or intellectually, let's do so with respect and responsibility. Let's marvel at the wonders of the past, while working to create a better future. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave me a comment down below letting me know your thoughts. I love reading what you have to say. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing. I would love to have it if you would join the family. And don't forget to follow me on social media to get updates on when I post new videos. I'll see you next time. Bye. This is chapter 6 of a new series called Across an Uncharted Land, based on the journey of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado into what we now call the American Southwest and the Great Plains in the year 1540. Last time we left off, our story was at its beginning, the city of Mexico in 1539. The Spanish conquistadors are preparing for their march north into the unknown. There has been a lot of talk about the riches of the recently conquered Aztec Empire and rumors of a northern kingdom even richer than that one. But before they can reach it, the Spaniards must endure a long and dangerous journey across an unfamiliar landscape. And so, on this day in March of 1540, they leave the familiar sights of Mexico City behind, cross the causeway over the Mexico River, then turn northwest, and begin their trek through the arid lands of the New World. The first 2 weeks of their journey were not exactly what Coronado had expected. As the Spaniards marched away from the central Mexican plateau, the terrain gradually changed from rolling hills and broad valleys to more rugged mountains and deep canyons. By the end of March, they had reached the southern edge of a vast desert and were now facing the daunting prospect of crossing it. All around them were scorching plains baked hard by the sun. In the distance, they could see what looked like rivers, but on closer inspection, those turned out to be nothing more than dry riverbeds cracked and hardened by the unrelenting heat. Coronado himself described the land as being without trees, without water, without beasts, and without birds, only lizards. It seemed an inhospitable and god-forsaken place. But the conquistadors had come this far, and there was no turning back. So with supplies low, they pressed on into the heart of the desert, where they would spend nearly 3 months battling hunger, thirst, and despair. Fortunately, during the course of their long trek, the Spaniards encountered several native tribes who had never seen a man of the cloth or a silver peso. The natives were curious about the newcomers and allowed the conquistadors to pass through their territories unharmed. Not all interactions went so smoothly. However, on one occasion, Coronado and his men came upon a village inhabited by a tribe he called the Tejas, or perhaps more accurately, the human-speaking peoples of the Sonoran Desert. The Spanish were warned not to harm any of the inhabitants and instead were told to act peacefully and charitably. But when one of the Spaniards started threatening the locals and their women, the natives responded by killing 2 horses. When the Spaniards retaliated by killing 2 of the Tejas men, a full-blown fight broke out. The natives were eventually driven off, but not before taking several casualties and losing some prisoners. From that moment on, Coronado wrote, "We found those Indians to be very hostile and ill-disposed towards us." Traveling through this inhospitable land, the Spaniards soon discovered how utterly dependent they were on the natives. Despite having enough supplies to last several days, the conquistadors struggled to find water fit to drink along the route. This meant that they often had to rely on the indigenous people to guide them to reliable water sources and safe places to camp. And while some natives proved to be loyal and trustworthy, others were less than forthcoming. At one point the Spaniards were guided by a native chief named Guaspa, who took them on a long detour over rough terrain in what Coronado suspected was an attempt to wear them down and make them easier to control. On April, after traveling over 200 leagues from their starting point, the weary Spaniards finally reached a river which they hoped would lead them to the rich lands promised by the natives. They had been walking in the desert for so long, in fact, that the sight of flowing water brought tears to their eyes. But their joy was short-lived. While the river was indeed large and wide, it flowed in the opposite direction from what they had hoped. So instead of following it downstream, they had to cross it and continue on upstream. To do this, they waded into the cold water up to their armpits and walked across. By the time they had finished, their clothes were torn and hanging in shreds, their shoes were broken and their bodies were scratched and sore. Now exhausted and demoralized, the Spaniards decided to set up camp and wait a few days to recover. While most of the men slept though, a few of them continued to walk upstream to try and find a better spot to establish their settlement. And it was then that they met an old friendly native who told them he was willing to guide them to a place where they could settle in comfortably. The next morning, the Spaniards moved to a clearing near a hill and began constructing huts to protect themselves from the elements. The rest of the week was spent hunting deer and other small animals to sustain the men while they waited for their supplies to catch up. By early May, the entire group had been settled in their new camp for over a week. Their situation was dire. Supplies were dangerously low and none of them had seen a Spaniard outside of the group. For over a month, they had been walking through desolate landscapes, struggling to survive. It was a far cry from the grand adventures they had dreamed of when they left Mexico. And yet, despite their hardships, the conquistadors knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. They needed to keep moving, but they needed guidance to know where to go. They needed supplies to keep them alive, and above all, they needed hope to keep them going. Unfortunately, the only person who could give them all of those things was the same person who had led them to this desolate place in the first place. There was a man among the conquistadors named Melchior de Guzman who had been with the expedition since its inception in Mexico. Melchior had originally come to the New World seeking wealth and glory, but he had quickly learned that neither of those things were easy to come by. He had fought in many battles against the Aztecs, and had seen firsthand the brutality of the Spanish conquest. But still, he had held out hope that the hardships he endured would eventually pay off. Now though, as he looked around at the exhausted faces of his companions, he knew that something had to change or they would all die in the middle of nowhere. Melchior had been paying close attention to the old native guide they had hired, and he noticed that the man seemed reluctant to take them farther north. Melchior decided that he had nothing to lose. He approached the guide and offered him double pay if he would take them to a reliable food source and a place where they could resupply. The guide agreed, and the next morning Melchior led the Spaniards away from camp and into the desert. After walking for several hours, the guide suddenly stopped and pointed to a clump of bushes ahead. Then he did something that completely shocked Melchior. He pulled a knife and cut open his own arm, letting blood drip onto the ground. "What are you doing?" Melchior asked, horrified. The guide didn't answer but motioned for Melchior to come closer. As Melchior leaned in, he saw that the blood had revealed a stash of corn buried beneath the sand. "I am showing you where we can get food," the guide said, smiling. Before long, the Spaniards had gathered so much food that they had to abandon their original plan of continuing north and instead set up camp to process and store the corn. After spending several days at the new camp, recovering from their ordeal, the Spaniards continued on north. Along the way, they met several other Native American tribes, each one more curious and welcoming than the last. The natives showed the Spaniards how to use the plants around them for food, medicine, and clothing, and the Spaniards shared with them the little food they had left. As the weeks passed, the Spaniards began to feel healthier and stronger once again. Their spirits lifted and they pressed on northwards, deeper and deeper into the unknown. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe for more content. Chapter 7: The Cities of Revealed. I have arrived at the top of House Rock. I've come to the end of the world. And here in front of me is the great city of gold, the mysterious seventh city of, or maybe it's just another one of the pueblos. Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's go check it out. So when I got up here, I was expecting to see something like this, right? Golden palaces everywhere. But what I actually saw was this. So yeah, not exactly what I was expecting. But hey, maybe if we just keep going further into the city, we'll start seeing some of that gold. Nope. This place is called Awiku Pueblo, or the village of the Zuni people. And it's pretty much just a bunch of simple adobe dwellings. The Zuni people are still here living in these very houses, and they are very much not happy with my intrusion on their land. See, when the conquistadors came through here in the 16th century, they asked the Zuni people where the cities of gold were, and the Zuni people said, "What cities of gold?" But the conquistadors were so sure that they were gonna find all this gold here that they just started killing the Zuni people, burning their villages and everything. And the survivors fled to the mountains and hid in caves. And then over time, those survivors slowly trickled back down out of the caves and rebuilt their villages. And then when Francisco Vázquez de Coronado came through here in 1540, he found the Zuni people rebuilding their lives. And again he asked them where the cities of gold were, and again they said they didn't know anything about any cities of gold. And he went ahead and slaughtered them all anyway, except for a few that managed to escape into the caves. And then finally, after years and years of this kind of thing, the Spanish crown stepped in and said, "Hey, enough with the killing people because they don't have any gold on them. Like, can we maybe try a different strategy?" And so the killing largely stopped. But the Spanish did force the Zuni people to move from their ancestral lands to this one little area over here. And ever since then, the Zuni people have lived here under the constant threat of violence from outside forces. First it was the Spanish, then it was the Mexicans, and then it was white settlers from the US government who wanted this land for farming and mining. And even today, the Zuni people still have to fight to keep their land and their culture alive. They're a proud people with a rich history and culture, but they've been through a lot of pain and suffering. And honestly, they probably want nothing more than to just be left alone. But no, I've shown up here looking for gold because some old conquistador said he saw a great city right here at the top of House Rock. And although the legend has proven to be false, I'm still angry. Not at the Zuni people, but at myself. I mean, at the beginning of this episode, I made a big show about how I was going to get distracted by local legends and myths. But I just did. I let a story that's been told for hundreds of years influence my decision-making. And now I am here standing in front of a bunch of very angry people who have every right to be upset with me. All I've done is show up unannounced in their village and demanded that they take me to the great city of gold. If this was me being an archaeologist, this would be completely unacceptable behavior. I would be laughed out of the community within seconds. And I think a lot of people probably expected me to be that kind of competent researcher who respects other cultures. But instead, I just proved myself to be a bumbling fool who lets legends and stories control his decisions rather than actual facts and research. And while I can laugh at myself most of the time, this situation isn't really conducive to that. These people have suffered greatly throughout history, and it's my fault that they have to relive all of that trauma, just because I did do my homework. Honestly, I just feel ashamed. I feel ashamed for getting all of my hopes up about finding gold here. For making a big show about how I wasn't gonna believe any legends, and then believing that very legend anyway. And worst of all, I feel ashamed for getting this far into my career without learning the most basic lesson of all, which is to listen to the locals. Because when I first showed up at the visitor center, I could have just asked a Park Service employee about local legends regarding the cities of gold, and they definitely would have told me about this place. But no, I had to act all smug and say, no legends or myths, just facts. And now look where it got me. And I guess that's the harsh reality of the situation. The legend of the 7 cities is a harsh reality for the Zuni people. It brought death and destruction to their land and their families, and it continues to cause them problems to this very day. For them, the legend is a source of pain and sorrow. For me, the legend was a source of excitement and intrigue, and I never stopped to consider the human cost of that excitement. I just figured it would be a fun little side quest to go on during my vacation, but it's not a side quest, it's someone's life story, and I treated that life story like it was a video game cutscene. I just skipped through it, trying to get to the next exciting part, but I can't do that. I have to sit here and face the consequences of my actions. Maybe I can apologize to the Zuni people for being such a jerk. Maybe they can teach me about their culture and their history, and how I can be a better ally to them, because right now I am not an ally. Right now I am an outsider who came in, caused a bunch of trouble and then left. And that's not okay. I need to do better. I need to be better. And the first step to doing that is listening to the locals. They've been telling me for centuries that the cities of gold don't exist, but I only listened when it was too late. In the end, the cities of gold are just a myth that was used to justify the killing and enslavement of countless Native Americans, a myth that led to the loss of life, culture, and land, a myth that I fell for hook, line, and sinker. As I make my way down House Rock, I feel nothing but shame and regret. I ruined my reputation with the locals. I wasted a bunch of time and money on a wild goose chase. And worst of all, I betrayed the trust of the Zuni people. But maybe, just maybe, they can forgive me. Maybe they can help me learn from my mistakes and become a better ally. Maybe they can teach me about their culture and history. And maybe, just maybe, they can show me how to be a better man. Hey everybody. I just wanted to say thank you for watching, and also apologize in advance for how rough some of these episodes might be. I'm re-recording all of these videos because I was going through a rough patch in my life, and some of those personal problems bled into the videos, and I'm really not proud of some of the stuff I said or did in those videos. I've already re-recorded several of them, and honestly it feels like a whole new series. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the 7 cities of gold, check out this playlist right here. I've got videos on each of the 7 cities, plus a couple bonus videos. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Coronado refused to give up. The Spanish explorer was pushed further and further into the American Southwest in search of the mythical 7 cities of gold. Now, after having failed to find the cities in today's southern Arizona, he is moving north. His men are becoming desperate, but Coronado is not. He is going to press his luck and explore even more lands, meeting new Native American tribes along the way, including the Pueblo peoples. But what will Coronado learn about these Native Americans? Will he be able to convert them to Christianity? And will he finally discover the fabled cities of gold? This is Chapter Beyond, a wider search of the Coronado Chronicles, the story of the first European to explore the American Southwest. As we begin Chapter 8, Coronado and his men have just entered the territory of the Aquinnah Indians, or the Aki, who live in the general area of present-day Tucson, Arizona. Here, the Spaniards were well received by the local chief who gifted them food and helped them to repair their supplies. This was because the Aki had been recently attacked by another tribe known as the Sobai. In fact, the Aki were so grateful for the help that Coronado offered them, that they wanted to give him a huge amount of gold in payment for the assistance. But he would have none of it. This was probably a tactic to keep the peace in the region. To accept such a gift would only cause future problems. Plus, Coronado was looking for gold mines, not gold ingots. Leaving this area, Coronado headed north toward the supposed location of the 7 cities of gold. Along the way, his men began to get sick once again, and they did not have the supplies to properly care for themselves. They were weak and hungry and continued to suffer greatly. Some historians claim that one of his men died of starvation, while others say that the man simply ran away and deserted the expedition. The latter may be true, but it is hard to know for sure. All we know is that one less mouth to feed made it easier for the remaining men to survive. Soon, the Spaniards came across the Salt River, which flowed right through the middle of the territory of the Sinagua people, who lived in the area of present-day northern Arizona. The Sinagua, like many other Native Americans, were very skilled farmers and would grow crops along the riverbanks. This would prove useful for Coronado and his starving men. They would trade with the natives and receive corn and meat in exchange for metal tools and other goods. But not all was well in this region. Soon after arriving, Coronado had to put down a small revolt by some of his men. Apparently, a group of soldiers had enough of exploring and searching for gold and wanted to return home. Instead, they took off into the wilderness, planning to forage for food and make their own way back to Mexico. Coronado, however, caught up with them and forced them to continue north. From here, the Spaniards crossed over the Little Colorado River and into the land of the Hopi people. Like many others in this region, built their homes atop mesas and cliffs, which was a stark contrast from the types of structures that the Spaniards were used to seeing. These Native Americans had built their towns out of stone and wood, and they often lived in caves when the Spaniards arrived. In the area of the present-day Hopi reservation, they encountered a large village and sent some of their men ashore to attempt to speak with the leader. When the Spaniards approached the town, however, the natives fled and abandoned their homes. This was probably due to fear, since the Europeans carried diseases that devastated Native American populations. Also, the Spaniards were known throughout the region for being ruthless towards those who opposed them, so it is understandable why the Hopi would flee their homes rather than risk being captured. After 3 days, Coronado and his men left this area and headed farther north into the land of the Zuni people. It was said that the Zuni were one of the few tribes in this area that were friendly towards the Spaniards. And indeed, when Coronado's men arrived at one of their villages, they were welcomed warmly and given food and water. The Spaniards learned that the Zuni had recently been attacked by another tribe known as the Acoma, who had stolen their food and supplies. Once again, Coronado decided to assist the natives and vowed to punish the Acoma for their actions. From here, the Spaniards traveled north to the Rio Grande Valley, where they encountered another powerful tribe, the Acoma. The Acoma were known for building their homes atop great mesas, which were sometimes hundreds of feet tall. This proved to be a challenge for the Spaniards, since they had to climb the steep cliffs to reach the top. Once there, they found a large village with many people and stores of food. The Spaniards asked for some of the food, but the Acoma refused and became hostile towards the Europeans. This caused Coronado to attack the village, and the two groups fought fiercely against each other. After a long battle, the Spaniards were victorious and took much of the village's food for themselves. Coronado then moved on, heading ever northward. At this point in his journey, the Spaniards were still looking for the 7 cities of gold, but had so far found no evidence of such a place. Many of his men were becoming disheartened, and it seemed as if the cities might only exist in legend. Coronado, however, was not ready to give up yet. He pushed his men onward into what is today Texas, and soon they came across the Pecos River. This river was important to the Spaniards, because it marked the beginning of the land of the Pueblos. The Pueblos were a group of Native American tribes who built their homes out of stone and were very skilled farmers. They also had a complex religion based on the worship of natural forces, and they often lived in large villages. As the Spaniards explored the area, they encountered many different Pueblos tribes, including the Taos, the Tesuque, and the San Juan. The Spaniards tried to convert the Pueblos to Christianity, but the natives were resistant to this. They had their own beliefs and did not want to change them. Despite this, the Spaniards continued to press forward, and soon they reached the Rio de las Animas, or the River of the Souls. The river was named for the large number of souls, both animal and human, that floated down its waters. This was a sad sight for the Spaniards, as it reminded them of the suffering that had occurred in this land. They also realized that they were far from any real source of food, and they began to starve. At this point, the entire expedition was on the verge of collapse. The men were tired, hungry, and losing faith in their leader. Coronado, however, would not give up. He knew that he had to find the 7 cities of gold, or he would be disgraced forever. He decided to build a fort near the river and call it San Buenaventura, and he left a small garrison of soldiers there while he went out hunting for food. Coronado was determined to succeed, and he pushed his men harder than ever before. He traveled all over the area, looking for the legendary cities, but he found nothing but disappointment. Finally, he had to admit defeat. The 7 cities of gold did not exist, or if they did, they were not in this area. Coronado returned to the fort, where he found that things had taken a turn for the worse. The soldiers were low on supplies, and the local Native Americans were becoming hostile. Coronado had to defend the fort, and he barely managed to do so. He realized that he could not stay in this area any longer, and he began to plan his return to Mexico. Coronado and his men traveled south, and as they went, they were harassed by the Native Americans. The Spaniards were exhausted and demoralized, and they could not fight back effectively. They were forced to flee for their lives, and they barely managed to escape with their heads. Finally, they reached Mexico, where they were greeted as heroes. Coronado had brought back tales of the wonders he had seen, and the people were fascinated by his stories. However, he knew that he had failed in his mission, and he was ashamed. He had not found the 7 cities of gold, and he had lost many men in the process. Coronado was a brave explorer, but he was haunted by the ghosts of his men for the rest of his life. So ends Chapter 8 of the Coronado Chronicles. Stay tuned for more adventures of the first European to explore the American Southwest. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a like. And if you'd like to support the channel even more, consider becoming a patron where you can watch each episode early and give your input on each video. You can also check out my podcast, available on various platforms. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Alright, Chapter 9, The Plains. So our story so far has been one of misfortune after another for these poor Spaniards. They've been attacked by natives, they've been captured by the Apache, they've barely escaped with their lives, and now they are wandering around looking for the legendary gold cities of Quivira. But here at least they can roam free. This is the Great Plains. When Coronado set out from Compostela, he left behind a man named El Turco. Now El Turco was a native guide that the Spaniards had picked up along the way. And El Turco told them that over there to the east lay a land of great wealth, a land full of gold and silver. He called it Quivira, which in the local Native American tongue meant something like the place of the setting sun. The Spaniards were of course ecstatic to hear this. They had been wandering around for months and months now, ever since leaving their settlement in New Galicia. They needed a good sign, and maybe Quivira would be their savior. And the march across the plains began, following the Arkansas River eastward. It would be a long one. The buffalo were everywhere. In fact, there were so many buffalo that it was hard to travel because the carcasses of dead buffalo littered the landscape. There were just thousands and thousands of buffalo bones all around them. One Spaniard wrote that it seemed as if an entire forest had been turned into bone. It was kind of creepy. The Spaniards followed the river, and El Turco pointed out where they should turn off trail to get to Quivira. Then they walked on. Sometimes it was hot, sometimes it was cold, but most of the time it was just boring. And days bled into weeks, and every day was the same. You could see for miles and miles in every direction. There were no trees, just grass, prairie dogs, buffalo, more grass, and then more buffalo. The men became desperate for something interesting to happen. Anything. All they wanted was to not look at another field of grass for the rest of their lives. But what happened instead was worse than anything they could have imagined, because as time went on, the weather got worse and worse. Storms rolled in, hail fell, lightning flashed, thunder boomed, and the wind howled, and they had nothing to do but huddle under the meager shelter of some rocks and try to stay dry. When the sun came back, the ground was hard as iron, and they started to run out of water, and then the flour ran out, and soon after that the meat supplies dwindled to nothing. The men ate whatever they could find: lizards, snakes, mice, rabbits, even the leather off the buffalo hides. They did not turn away from eating any animal that they could catch or kill. They were starving. And then sickness began to spread through the camp. Men died and were buried in shallow graves. On top of the buffalo bones, some of the men even began to go crazy. One man talked about seeing his dead wife, and then he stood up and tried to leap into the air and touch the sky, and then he fell down and died. Another man cut off the tip of his nose and then bit off his own fingers, and others just stared off into space for hours and days, not saying a word, completely lost in their own minds. All the while, El Turco, the guide, just kept promising that Quivira was right around the corner. Soon, he said, very soon. But the men didn't believe him anymore. Their faith in the guide had vanished. Instead, they blamed him for all their problems. yelling and screaming at him to turn around and lead them back west to safety. Coronado finally stepped in and quieted everyone down. Then he announced that they were going to continue on to Quivira, but when they found it, he said, if it wasn't a place of great wealth, they would all turn around and come home. And the men agreed to this plan. They had nothing to lose. Finally, on June 10, 1541, after 5 long months on the plains, they saw smoke rising on the horizon. Hurrah! People, civilization. They quickly approached the village, and their hearts sank. There weren't a lot of people, just a few small groups of natives in what looked like very ordinary huts, and none of them were wearing any gold. Coronado rode forward and introduced himself and his men to the village elders. He told them he was from the Emperor Charles V of Spain, and he asked them where was the great city of Quivira, the city of gold. The old men looked at each other. No one spoke Spanish, so communication was slow and difficult, but they eventually learned that the natives hadn't heard of any golden city nearby, so they kept going. As they walked from village to village, Coronado traded with the natives, getting food and information, but they never heard of any rich city of gold. The people they met had never seen any gold, but they did tell the Spaniards of another village a little further to the north that maybe, just maybe, would know what they were looking for, and so they went north. It was another 2 months of walking before they arrived at what would be their last village of the trip. By this point, Coronado was absolutely furious. His men were sick and tired of the deception. They thought they'd been lied to. They wanted revenge. But what happened next made them all feel pretty stupid. When Coronado entered the final village, he saw lots of people and lots of huts, but that was about it. Nothing special, nothing particularly rich or impressive. He decided to sneak into one of the huts and see what was inside. It was dark inside, so he couldn't see much, but he felt around and touched something that was shiny, so he rubbed it on his shirt and held it up to his eyes. It was a gold pendant. He found a couple more, and then a necklace and earrings and other little trinkets, but it wasn't the kind of wealth that they were expecting. It was mostly small items, not ingots or bars or chests overflowing with coin. Coronado was about to march his men to the nearest river to start their long walk back home. The journey across the plains had taken its toll on them. They were all skin and bones now. The men were too weak to fight, too hungry to really do much of anything. They were just hoping to make it back to civilization alive, and when they did finally reach the river, they were overjoyed. The river was the boundary between the plains and the civilized lands of the south. They were almost home, but when they reached the other side, they were shocked to see who was waiting for them. It was El Turco, the guide who had led them to the plains and then basically lied to them about Quivira being anywhere around here. He had been waiting for them on the other side of the river, and when he saw how weak and emaciated they were, he just laughed at them and then walked away. Coronado shouted at him, yelling that he had lied to them and led them on a wild goose chase across the plains. El Turco turned around and said, "No, you were the ones who lied to me, not the other way around." What? Apparently, when El Turco had first approached the Spaniards, they had offered him a deal, and El Turco had accepted. He was going to help them find Quivira, and in return they would make him governor of Quivira once they found it. Coronado and his men argued that this wasn't true, that they had never offered El Turco any position, let alone governor of a city that didn't even exist. But El Turco insisted that they had made the offer, and he had refused. But the Spaniards wanted Quivira, so they had basically tricked him into helping them find the city. Coronado threw his hands up in the air. He knew there was no point in arguing with the guide. He had proven to be incredibly useful, and without him they would have never made it across the plains. Coronado had to admit that they owed the guy, but he still wasn't above stabbing him in the back. Coronado and his men left El Turco and the river behind them and headed for home. The long walk back to civilization took another 5 months. When they finally arrived, only 40 of the original 2,000 men were still alive. Now, after hearing this tale, you might think that El Turco was some kind of evil villain who led these poor Spaniards on a merry chase across the plains. But remember, El Turco was a native who had his own culture, his own people, his own way of looking at the world, and from his perspective, these guys had showed up in his part of the world uninvited, and they had killed his people and were killing his friends. For El Turco, the Spaniards probably looked like some kind of invaders, and if the Spaniards trusted him enough to ask for his help, then he could probably get some revenge by leading them on a long and pointless journey across the plains. In the end, both sides ended up hating each other. And that's about the best way to sum up the relationship between the natives and the conquistadors. In the meantime though, we are done with chapter 9. If you enjoyed this episode, then please hit that subscribe button and leave me a comment about what I should write about next. I'll see you next time. In our last video, we talked about how Francisco Coronado and his crew had spent the entire year, 1540 to 1541, exploring the American Southwest, without finding any gold or any real towns of wealth. And it was at this point that Coronado decided he needed to go back home. Hey there, and welcome back to the series, The Adventures of Francisco Coronado, in which I am slowly but surely covering the life and times of one of Spain's greatest explorers. We left off with Coronado and his army having just failed to find any gold or riches in the province of Quivira, and so he and his remaining men are preparing to head home. But there is still a lot of pain and suffering that they must endure before they can be done with this horrible expedition. So let's see what happens next. But before we dive into all that, I wanted to thank today's sponsor, Masterworks. One of the things that makes history such a great subject to study is that it has everything. There are stories of war and peace, of love and loss, of courage and cowardice, of triumph and tragedy. It's a reflection of the full spectrum of the human condition, and nowhere is this more evident than in the world of art. And now let's get back to the video. So the first thing that happened after Coronado's decision to turn back was that he sent 2 of his captains back to Compostela. Captain Diego de Souza with 200 foot soldiers and Captain Antonio de Espejo with 30 horsemen and about 120 infantrymen. And it was at this time that these 2 groups became the first Europeans ever to cross the modern US-Mexico border. Sosa y Barrera would later write a detailed account of his journey from Zuni territory to Compostela. His group traveled along the Rio Grande and then turned toward the north, until they reached a large body of water that was probably either the Arkansas River or the Rio Grande. At some point, they also had an encounter with a tribe of Native Americans that Sosa y Barrera believed to be the same people who had attacked the survivors of Cabeza de Vaca's expedition. He wrote, "We said to them that we were Christians and friends of the Turk, and asked them if they knew where we could find him. They replied that they had seen him go north. God knows how happy we were to hear this, for by this means we thought we should find the Christians who had been lost for 3 years. Unfortunately for them, though, when they finally did find the remains of Cabeza de Vaca's crew, they found nothing but bones. Still, the 2 groups made it safely back to Mexico City and gave their reports to the Spanish authorities, who were not very impressed by what they heard. Sosa y Barrera was actually imprisoned for a while, because the viceroy didn't believe his story about seeing the bones of the lost Spaniards, but eventually he was freed and both he and Sosa de Espinosa were given command of future expeditions into the area, but neither would ever set out on those journeys. Now, meanwhile, Coronado and his crew continued on their way back to the coast, but even as he began to see the familiar landscape of Nueva Esparga around him, he was filled with despair because he knew that he would be considered a failure by the Spanish. He wrote, "We went on in the same manner during the whole summer, always hoping that something good would turn up, but we found only great deserts, rivers without fish, fruits or game, and no gold or Christians. What little we had taken with us on leaving Mexico was already exhausted, and we had eaten all our supplies long before reaching these shores again, and all our men were so emaciated that many died from this, especially among the cavalry. Of the 180 men who had gone from Compostela to explore the Quivira, 60 had died from starvation and fatigue, and the rest were so weak that they could hardly walk. We found many dead bodies along the way, and others abandoned in the belief that they would die. And in fact, some who were picked up in this way did die. Of his original force of 2,000 men, Coronado had less than 900 when he arrived back in Mexico City in September of 1541, and those that did survive were physically broken by their experience." He continued, "The horses were all skin and bone, and many died on the road, and what was most pitiful was to see those poor devils on foot, dragging themselves along, helping each other and sometimes carrying their comrades who had fallen down, unable to rise again. Even the Indian slaves whom we had bought in the villages we visited and who had seemed strong and robust, died from grief at seeing their homeland so devastated and destroyed by the excessive heat and lack of food." When he reported back to the viceroy about his discovery of no gold and practically no one left to tax, the viceroy wasn't exactly kind to him, but really, how could he have expected anything else? Of the 2,000 men who had set out on this expedition, 1,100 were now dead. The vast majority of those deaths happening right at the end when the survivors were too weak to continue on. All the gold, silver, and precious stones that they had brought back with them amounted to nothing but copper nuggets and small turquoise stones. And when they had explored an entire province, the only town they had found was a small village of grass huts. It was truly a total failure, a humiliating defeat for Spain. And so Coronado fell into disgrace, and he returned to Spain in 1542 with a severely damaged reputation. Most accounts of his life after this point are often vague or contradictory or unreliable, but here's what we think happened. He returned to Spain hoping that he could get another chance to prove himself, but he never got that opportunity. He spent his final days working as a lowly customs official in Seville, quietly passing away sometime before 1554. If you want to know more about his early life, then check out part 1 of this series, where I covered his youth, his rise through the ranks of the conquistadors, and his initial explorations in Florida. And if you want to know more about the rest of this expedition, then you can check out part 2, where I cover his exploration of the American Southwest. And if you want to know more about what happened after he got back to Spain, then you can check out part 3, where I cover his later life and his death. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any episodes. You can follow me on social media to get updates when new videos come out. And if you'd like to help support the channel, then become a patron through the link in the description below. Your support helps keep the series going, and I really appreciate your generosity. So thanks, and with that, I'll see you next time. Alright, let's get this one out of the way first. No, Francisco Coronado didn't find any gold in the American Southwest. In fact, he didn't find any gold at all. But hey, if you're gonna miss the big one, might as well map most of the American Southwest in the process. And that is exactly what happened in Chapter 11, Legacy of Coronado. Francisco Pizarro may have been the most famous conquistador, but there were plenty of others who went on expeditions across the Americas. And we've already talked about a couple, Hernando Cortés and Vasco Núñez de Balboa. But now it's time to talk about Francisco Coronado. Coronado was a conquistador from Spain who sailed to the Americas in 1535. Like Cortés before him, Coronado had orders to find gold, but he also had orders to explore. And so while he searched for gold, he explored a whole lot more. His expedition took him through modern-day Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Kansas, Oklahoma, and maybe even into Nebraska. This is an incredibly large area, and they managed to traverse all of it in just 2 years. There are many things to take away from the exploration of Coronado, but the legacy of his expedition is really what makes it so interesting. As always, let's go back to the beginning. After spending some time settling into the settlement of Compostela in what is today Mexico, Coronado set out on his expedition on November 1536 with about 300 men, 2 priests, and a few hundred indigenous allies. They traveled north toward the Pueblo people, hoping to trade for horses, which they desperately needed to traverse the lands ahead. From the Pueblo, Coronado heard stories of a great city to the north called Quivira, where the streets were paved with gold, so off they went following those stories. As they traveled north, they became the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon. Unfortunately, their reactions weren't quite what you would expect. You see, when they came upon the canyon, they believed it to be the legendary 7 cities of gold. If you recall from our episode about the 7 cities of gold, that legend started in Europe and made its way across the ocean via the tales of explorers like Christopher Columbus. The idea of finding gold was what motivated many explorers to come to the Americas, and this was just another case of that happening. Because of their belief, Coronado and his crew didn't spend much time exploring the area. They sent a few men down into the canyon to look around, but they didn't go far. They killed a few natives and stole some of their stuff, then left. If only they knew how wrong they were. They traveled north into present-day New Mexico, where they encountered several indigenous tribes, some peacefully and some not so peacefully. Coronado attempted to subjugate the natives and force them into working for the Spanish, but they resisted. The Spanish were able to defeat them due to their superior weaponry, but it wasn't easy. One of these battles occurred at a place called Pugosa, and it's remembered as the Battle of Pugosa. It was a major victory for the Spanish, and they used it as leverage in future negotiations with other tribes. As the Spanish moved further north, they reached the plains for the first time, and they absolutely loved it. They had never seen such an expanse of flat land, and they believed it to be the end of the world. They named it the Bay of the End of the World, and since they thought they had reached the end of the earth, they decided to head back south to Quivira. On the way back, they had more interactions with various Native American tribes. Some of these were peaceful and some were violent, but all of them taught the Spanish something about the geography and culture of the region. Throughout their travels, they documented everything they saw, from the animals to the plants to the geography and the native people. Their writings are invaluable resources for understanding what the Southwest looked like before European colonization. Unfortunately, despite their amazing discoveries, they still had no luck finding gold. So in 1538, Coronado returned to Mexico City, ending his expedition. He had traveled over 10,000 miles, discovered much of the American Southwest and found nothing. Of course, this did not sit well with Coronado. He believed that the stories of Quivira were true and that the natives were hiding their gold from him, so he decided to go back and look for it. He headed back out into the desert with only a small group of men, but he disappeared and was never seen again. This isn't a History Channel video, but it's worth pointing out that the indigenous people who lived in the areas Coronado and his crew explored did not believe the stories of the 7 cities of gold either. What the Spaniards were experiencing as they crossed the Southwest were real cities, and they were full of gold. But it wasn't the kind of gold that the Spaniards were looking for. Most of the gold that they saw was in the form of nuggets. It wasn't pure gold, but it was gold nonetheless. In fact, it's because of this that they named the river they traveled on the River of Gold. But the Spanish weren't interested in small nuggets. They wanted massive veins of gold that they could easily collect. Basically, they wanted to strike it rich without having to do much work. So while Coronado and his crew did see gold, they didn't see it as valuable. What they did see was a completely new world. They encountered vast open grasslands and majestic canyons. And though they weren't the first Europeans to see these things, they were the first to explore them thoroughly. There were some explorers who had made it to the Grand Canyon before them, but none of them had traveled as far as Coronado did. Despite their failure to find gold, the seeds had been planted for future Spanish colonization in the region. When Coronado returned to Mexico City, he wrote a letter to the king describing everything he had seen, and it wasn't long before other explorers were heading out to the southwest. In 1540, the Spanish sent out a new expedition led by Garcia López de Cardenas. This expedition was similar to Coronado's, but it was much smaller. Cardenas and his crew traveled through present-day New Mexico and Arizona, and they were the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon from the south. They also explored parts of western Texas and eastern California, and they, too, found nothing but stories of a great city to the north called Quivira, but it was actually the Cardenas expedition that came closest to finding gold. They found a small gold mine in present-day Arizona, but it wasn't the type of gold that they were looking for. Still, they did find enough gold to prove that there was gold in the region. This is what led to the Spanish colonization of the Southwest. Over the next 100 years, the Spanish would establish missions, presidios and pueblos throughout the region in an attempt to convert the natives to Christianity and extract as many natural resources as possible. It's hard to say what would have happened to the Southwest if Coronado hadn't explored it, but it's safe to say that it would have been very different. Coronado's journey through the American Southwest was one of the most important events in the history of the region. It marked the beginning of the Spanish colonization of the Southwest, and it led to centuries of cultural exchange between the Spanish and the native peoples. If you want to learn more about that cultural exchange, we've got a whole video on that, right? The impact of Coronado's journey is still felt today. The places he visited are home to a rich diversity of cultures, languages, and traditions, and his journey is a reminder of the importance of exploring and understanding different cultures. But maybe most importantly, it's a reminder that gold isn't always where you think it'll be. Maybe the real gold was the friends we made along the way. That's a line I definitely didn't steal from The Simpsons. Nope, not at all. Anyway, thanks for watching. Tune in next time when we continue our journey into the early days of the French and Indian War with Chapter 20, the Ohio Valley. The bright lights fade, the crowd disperses, and now only a handful of stars remain. As I sit here waiting for my cue, I can't help but think about the incredible tales I've heard tonight. It feels like we've been on quite the adventure, hasn't it? One thing that's certain is that Coronado never found the wealth he sought. Yet somehow it seems he got much more than he ever expected. For all the gold he missed out on, he learned about new lands and different cultures. He gathered tales of amazing creatures and myths from all walks of life, and he made connections with people who, like him, were chasing their own dreams. Some found their fortunes and others became legends. In the end, his search may not have yielded the riches he imagined, but it did teach him and us a valuable lesson. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't measured in gold or jewels, but in the knowledge, stories and friendships that enrich our lives. Just think about the countless myths and legends we've come across on this journey. How many of them have become part of your own story? How many have inspired you to keep chasing your dreams, no matter how tough things get? As the moon climbs higher in the sky, casting its silvery glow over the audience, I feel a sense of calm wash over me. The thrill of the hunt, the excitement of the chase, they're all part of the journey, aren't they? But sometimes the quiet moments like these are what make a story truly shine. Just as the night is filled with a million tiny wonders, so too is life filled with little joys that make it all worthwhile. It's time to close this chapter, to bring the music and the laughter to a gentle end. And yet the echoes of our adventure will linger, reminding us that the greatest treasures aren't always where we expect them to be. They can be found in the most unexpected places, in the stories that touch our hearts and the friendships that warm our souls. As the last notes fade away and the stage grows dark, take a moment to reflect on the journey we've shared. Think about the dreams that have inspired you, the myths that have captivated you, and the friends who have walked alongside you. Remember the laughter, the joy, and the camaraderie that have enriched your life. And now, as the darkness deepens and the stars twinkle above, let the quiet hum of contentment settle over you. Let the gentle embrace of night lull you into a peaceful slumber. Dream sweet dreams, my friends, and may your own adventures always lead you to the treasures that matter most. And now, my friends, it's time to say our goodbyes. The stage is empty, the music is silent, and the lights have dimmed. But the memories of our adventure together will live on. Just like Coronado and his companions, we've chased dreams and followed myths, seeking treasures both tangible and intangible. As I step into the darkness, I can't help but smile, knowing that our paths have crossed and that our stories have intertwined for a little while. You've shared with me tales that have touched my soul and inspired my imagination to soar. And though our time together has come to an end, the echoes of your voices will resonate within me long after the final curtain call. Coronado's journey, much like our own, has come full circle. He returned home, forever changed by the wonders he had witnessed and the experiences he had embraced. Though the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow remained elusive, he carried with him a wealth of knowledge, stories and friendships that had become his true treasure. Like him, we've traversed uncharted territories, both literal and metaphorical, facing challenges and discovering beauty in every step. We've encountered mythical creatures and learned about ancient cultures, realizing that the world is filled with magic and mystery. But now it's time for me to turn back the curtain and disappear into the shadows. Just as Coronado must eventually face the reality of his unfulfilled dreams. Yet as I do, I want you to remember that the journey is never truly over. The spirit of adventure lives on within each and every one of us, waiting for its next chapter to unfold. Keep your hearts open to the whispers of the wind, for they carry secrets of faraway lands and forgotten lore. Let your curiosity be your compass, guiding you to hidden pathways and unexplored realms. And when the shadows grow long and the day is done, gather around the flickering light of imagination and share your tales with those who yearn for adventure. For it is in the telling and the listening that the magic truly lies. As the final notes fade into silence and the stage is plunged into darkness, know that the adventure continues in your dreams. Sleep well, my friends, and may your dreams be filled with the wonders and the magic that we've discovered together tonight. When you wake, carry a piece of this evening's enchantment with you, letting it inspire you to seek out the treasures that await you in the tapestry of life. For just as Coronado found more than he had ever dreamed of, so too will you discover that the greatest journeys lead to destinations both seen and unseen. Dream sweet dreams of faraway lands, of mythical creatures, and of the enduring power of friendship and courage. May the laughter echo in your heart and the warmth of camaraderie surround you like a comforting blanket. For even as we part ways for now, the bonds we forged will endure, strengthened by the shared experience of our extraordinary adventure. Until we meet again, keep your spirits high, your laughter loud, and your hearts open to the endless possibilities that lie ahead. May your future be filled with the same magic and wonder that has captivated us tonight, and may the echoes of our adventure serve as a reminder that the greatest treasures are often found in the most unexpected places. And so, my friends, I bid you farewell. Go forth and chase your dreams with all your heart, for life is a grand adventure waiting to be explored. Embrace the unknown with open arms, for it holds wonders beyond your wildest imaginings. Keep the spirit of adventure alive, for it is the key to unlocking the hidden treasures that await you. Sleep well and dream big, for in your dreams, the impossible becomes possible and the boundaries of imagination know no limits. Until we meet again, may the stars guide your path and the moon light your way, and may the echoes of our adventure together serve as a reminder that the greatest journeys are those that touch the heart and ignite the soul. Go now, my friends, and may your dreams take you to places you've only dared to imagine. With a final wave and a whispered goodbye, I turn to go, allowing the darkness to envelop me. But before I do, I leave you with these parting words. Remember the magic that we've shared tonight, for it is a magic that lives within us all. Carry it with you always, and let it be a source of wonder and joy in your life. And so, with a heavy heart and a grateful spirit, I say farewell. May your dreams be filled with the enchantment of our adventure, and may the echoes of our laughter linger in your heart long after the final curtain call. Until we meet again on some other starlit night, may the magic of our adventure continue to shine brightly in your life.